The air in the funeral home was thick, heavy with the cloying sweetness of lilies and the silent, suffocating weight of performative grief. Rain traced lazy, distorted paths down the tall panes of stained glass, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of gray and green. I sat on the hard oak of the front pew, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in the lap of my dark wool dress. Before me, the mahogany casket gleamed under the soft, artificial light, a ridiculously opulent box for a man whose soul had been fashioned from dust and calculation. People who passed me, my distant cousins and their spouses, the business associates of my father, offered their condolences in hushed, reverent tones. They saw a quiet old woman, her face a placid mask, and assumed the grief was too profound for tears. They were wrong. I hadn't wept for Richard Sterling in 45 years. Mourning is an indulgence reserved for loss, and I had lost my father not in a sterile hospital room the previous week, but decades ago, in a cold, wood-paneled study that smelled of expensive cigars and betrayal. I was not here to mourn. I was here to witness, to watch the final act of a meticulously crafted play, and when the curtain fell, to collect a debt that had been accruing interest for a lifetime. My cousin Charlotte, a woman whose face was a testament to the marvels of modern surgery, dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Her husband stood beside her, his expression one of solemn importance, as if his mere presence sanctified the event. They murmured something about my father being at peace now. Peace was a luxury Richard Sterling had never understood, let alone earned. His entire existence was a frantic, relentless pursuit of more wealth, more influence, more prestige. His life was a fortress built to protect his name, and he had been willing to sacrifice anything, and anyone, to keep its walls intact. I could feel the whispers rustling through the pews behind me, like dry leaves. Poor Evelyn, one would say. She was never quite right after, you know. Another would add, so troubled. Her father did everything for her. They spoke of me as a family tragedy, a broken doll left on the shelf. The girl who had a nervous breakdown, who couldn't cope, who simply vanished into a life of quiet obscurity. I had cultivated that narrative with the same patience a gardener tends a rare and poisonous flower. I had allowed them to believe it, to pity me. Their pity had been a shield, my obscurity a weapon. They saw a ghost, frail and faded. They had no idea that a ghost can see everything, unburdened by the need to be seen in return. The organ began a somber, droning hymn, the kind of music meant to fill the spaces where genuine emotion was absent. The minister, a man who hadn't known my father beyond a few substantial donations to the church renovation fund, began his eulogy. He spoke of a titan of industry, a pillar of the community, a devoted family man. The words washed over me, hollow and meaningless. A devoted family man. The irony was so bitter it almost made me smile. My gaze drifted from the casket to the stained glass window beside the altar. It depicted a shepherd guiding his flock. The afternoon light, weak as it was, hit a shard of blue glass, refracting a single, piercing beam that struck the polished floor. It was a cold, sharp light, and for a heartbeat, the hushed, perfumed air of the funeral home dissolved. The scent of lilies was replaced by the metallic tang of blood and the damp, musty smell of a cheap Chicago apartment. The organ's dirge faded, and in its place was the sound of my own ragged breathing, a high, thin whistle in my ears. The polished mahogany of the casket became the cracked, silvered surface of a bathroom mirror, and staring back at me was not the composed 70-year-old woman I was now, but a girl of 20. Her name was Emma. My name was Emma. Her face, my face, was a grotesque canvas of purple and blue. One eye was swollen completely shut, the skin around it a sickening shade of eggplant. Her lower lip was split, a raw red line against the pallor of her skin. A dark bruise, the distinct shape of a man's fingers, was blooming on her jawline. She was staring at her own reflection with a kind of detached horror, as if trying to recognize the person trapped behind the damage. It was the face of a girl who had just learned that love and violence could live in the same heart, in the same hands. It was the face of a girl who was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And in the depths of her one good eye, a single tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the blood and grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of incandescent rage. Just as quickly as it came, the vision vanished. I was back in the pew, the blue light gone, the minister's voice droning on about my father's supposed generosity. My heart rate hadn't changed. My hands hadn't trembled. 45 years of practice had taught me to be the master of my own composure. I had built a fortress of my own, not of wealth, but of silence and control. I looked back at the casket. Inside lay the man who had seen his daughter's pain and had chosen to protect his reputation instead of her. The man who had handed her a check and told her to disappear so that his perfect world would not be tainted by her messy, inconvenient trauma. He had been the architect of my first death, the death of Emma Sterling. He could never have imagined that from her ashes, someone else would rise, someone patient, someone methodical. Someone who understood, as he did, the power of assets and liabilities. They all think they know my story, the girl who had a breakdown and ran away. They have no idea. My story didn't begin with me leaving, with the bruises, or even with the betrayal. My story began with a boy who lived on Chestnut Street. His name was Jacob Vance, and he didn't live on Chestnut Street. Not really. His family had a stately home there, one of those limestone manors with ivy-covered walls and a nameplate by the door. But he was a creature of the city, of the university campus where we met. The name, Chestnut Street, simply became my shorthand for him, a symbol of the solid, respectable world he seemed to represent, a world I desperately wanted to believe in. Before Jacob, my life in Chicago felt like a boundless horizon. I was 20, a junior in English literature, and the city was my textbook. I found poetry in the rhythm of the L train rattling overhead, in the way the autumn wind swept down the canyons of downtown, carrying the scent of roasted nuts and exhaust fumes. My world was my small but sunny apartment near campus, shared with my best friend Sarah. It was late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee, passionate debates about Faulkner in overheated classrooms, and the easy, uncomplicated laughter of friends who knew my history and shared my dreams. I was happy. More than that, I was free, though I didn't have the wisdom then to know what a precious and fragile thing that was. I first saw him at a university fundraiser, a stuffy affair I'd been dragged to by a professor. He stood across the crowded room, not part of the boisterous groups of fraternity boys or the earnest clusters of academics, but observing it all with a look of detached amusement. He was beautiful, in a way that seemed both classical and modern. He had dark, thick hair that fell perfectly across his forehead, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of whiskey that seemed to miss nothing. When he finally noticed me watching him, he didn't give a predatory smile or a cocky nod. He simply held my gaze for a moment, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his expression, before making his way through the crowd towards me. "I've been trying to figure out your story," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that cut through the chatter. "You're the only person here who looks like they'd rather be reading a book." I laughed, caught off guard. "Is it that obvious?" "It's refreshing," he replied, his smile finally appearing. It was devastating. "I'm Jacob Vance." "Emma Sterling," I said. "Emma Sterling," he repeated, tasting the name. "It sounds like a character from one of those books. The smart, quiet heroine who's more interesting than anyone else in the room." And just like that, he had me. He didn't just compliment me. He offered me a version of myself that I wanted to be. That was Jacob's greatest gift, his most insidious trick. He saw the person you longed to be and reflected it back at you, making you believe he was the only one who could truly see you. Our first few weeks were a golden blur, a whirlwind romance so perfect it felt scripted. He built a beautiful cage for me, and I walked into it willingly, enchanted by its gilded bars. The bars were made of promises, the lock forged from my own hope. He'd show up at my apartment after my last class with a bouquet of freesias, my favorite, a detail I'd mentioned once in passing. He took me for picnics by the shore of Lake Michigan, where we'd watch the sailboats, and he'd listen, truly listen, as I talked about my passion for modernist poetry, his gaze so intense I felt like the most fascinating creature on earth. He made my ambitions feel not just valid, but vital. One afternoon, sitting on a blanket as the city skyline shimmered in the distance, I confessed my dream of getting a doctorate and one day becoming a professor. He took my hand, his thumb tracing patterns on my knuckles. "Of course you will," he said with unwavering certainty. "You have a mind that deserves to be shared. I can't wait to be the proud husband in the back of the lecture hall, telling everyone I knew you when." He spoke of us and our future with such ease, it felt less like a proposition and more like an established fact. He was weaving my future into his, and it felt like being wrapped in the warmest, safest blanket. But the first threads of the cage were already being woven, so subtly I didn't even notice. Sarah, my roommate, tried to. After a few weeks of me canceling our plans to be with Jacob, she sat on my bed one night. "I barely see you anymore, Em," she said, her tone gentle. "This guy seems great, but don't forget you have a life outside of him." I was defensive. "He just gets me, Sarah." It's different. The next evening, Sarah's boyfriend was having a small party. Jacob and I were supposed to go. An hour before, he drew a bath for me, filling the tiny bathroom with steam and the scent of lavender oil. "Let's just stay in tonight," he whispered, kissing my neck. "Just us. The world outside is so loud. In here, I can hear you think." It was impossibly romantic. I called Sarah and made an excuse. From the other room, I heard Jacob's sigh of contentment. It wasn't until much later that I recognized it for what it was, the quiet satisfaction of a victory. Another time, we were walking downtown, and I stopped to look in a shop window at a dress, a simple, elegant green silk. "It's beautiful," I murmured. Jacob squeezed my arm a little too tightly, his smile never faltering. "It is," he agreed, "but it would draw too much attention. I like it better when you're the only one I can't take my eyes off of." He steered me away from the shop, and I felt a strange mixture of flattery and a faint, unnameable unease. He was turning his jealousy into a form of devotion, a possessiveness that he framed as protection. He told me I was his world. The truth? He just wanted a world he could control. He began to critique my friends, always with a soft touch. "Sarah was a bit of a party girl, wasn't she? My study partner, a harmless, bookish boy named Mark, was clearly in love with you, so perhaps I should work alone to avoid giving him the wrong idea." Each suggestion was wrapped in the guise of concern for me, for us. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was merely offering a better way, a way that always ended with the two of us, alone, in the perfect, quiet bubble he was creating. And I, so drunk on the feeling of being cherished, helped him build the walls myself. I drifted from Sarah. I found excuses to study in our apartment instead of the library. My vibrant, sprawling world, once the size of Chicago, began to shrink, until it was the exact size of the small apartment we decided to rent together, a place where he was the sun and I was a planet caught in his orbit, content for a time to draw all my light from him. The magic, of course, couldn't last. No illusion can withstand the harsh glare of reality, and the reality was that our apartment, once a cozy haven, began to feel like a pressure cooker. The four walls that had defined our perfect world became its boundaries. Jacob's adoration, once a warm and comforting sun, now felt like a heat lamp, intense and inescapable. His moods began to dictate the climate of our home. A good day for him meant a day of cloying affection and suffocating praise for me. A bad day, triggered by some perceived slight at his part-time job, or a comment from his father he didn't like, meant a day of tense silence, where I found myself tiptoeing around, measuring my words, my very breath, trying not to be the thing that made the pressure finally explode. The first crack wasn't a hairline fracture. It was a seismic event that shattered the very foundation of my world. It started, as the most catastrophic things often do, with something utterly trivial. I was on the phone in the living room talking to Mark, my old study partner from my literature seminar. I hadn't seen him in months, but I was stuck on a paper and remembered he had written a brilliant essay on the very topic. The call was brief, academic, and entirely innocent. "I can't believe you remember that paper," he was saying with a laugh. "It's probably in a box in my parents' attic, but I can tell you the main sources I used if that helps." "Mark, you'd be a lifesaver," I said, scribbling on a notepad. "I owe you one." It was then that I felt a change in the air. I looked up and saw Jacob leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't smiling. His face, usually so expressive and warm, was a blank, cold mask. I finished the call quickly, a nervous flutter in my stomach. Thanks again, Mark. Bye. I hung up, forcing a bright smile for Jacob. That was just Mark from my old poetry class. He was giving me some sources for my final paper. I know who he is, Jacob said, his voice quiet, devoid of any inflection. He didn't move from the doorway. Okay, I said, my smile faltering. Well, it was nice of him. I was really stuck. Why are you talking to him? He asked it as a simple question, but it felt like an accusation. I told you, for my paper? He's really smart. Why didn't you just ask me for help? He interrupted, pushing off the doorframe and taking a slow step into the room. You're in business, Jacob. This is about TS. Elliot, I didn't think you'd be interested. So you called him instead, he stated. You went to him. It wasn't going to him. I just called him on the phone. My voice was rising in frustration. Why are you acting like this? It was nothing. It's never nothing, Emma. He was closer now. Do you think I'm stupid? The way he used to look at you in the library, you think I didn't see that? That's insane. We were just friends, study partners. Friends, he scoffed, the word a bitter poison on his tongue. He snatched the notepad from my hand. What else did you two talk about? Nothing. Give that back. I reached for it, and in that instant, everything changed. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his fingers clamping down like a vice. The other hand didn't push me or shake me. It balled into a fist and, in a single vicious movement, he didn't swing at my face. He swung at the phone on the small end table, smashing it against the wall where it exploded in a shower of plastic. The violence of the act was so sudden, so shocking, that I screamed. It was the scream that did it. His head snapped towards me, his eyes wild with a fury I had never seen. Don't you scream at me, he hissed, his face inches from mine. Instinctively, I raised my hands to protect myself. It was a mistake. His rage, meant for the inanimate phone, found a new target. He grabbed my left hand and twisted. A sound, a wet, sickening crack, echoed in the small room. It was a sound I felt more than heard, a white-hot spike of agony that shot up my arm. I collapsed onto the floor, cradling my hand, the world dissolving into a gray haze of pain and disbelief. The first time he hit me, he broke a bone in my hand. But in that moment, as I stared up at him from the floor, I knew he had broken something far more important. He had broken the spell. The beautiful, charismatic man I loved had vanished, and in his place stood this terrifying stranger, his chest heaving, his face a mask of rage. Then just as quickly, the stranger vanished too. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a look of utter horror. Oh my God, he whispered, his eyes fixed on my hand, now beginning to swell to a grotesque size. Emma, oh God, what did I do? He dropped to his knees beside me, his own tears now streaming down his face. He tried to touch my hand, but I flinched back with a cry. I'm sorry, he sobbed, the words choked and desperate. I'm so sorry, baby. When I heard you on the phone with him, I saw red. I get so scared of losing you. It's because I love you so much. Please, please believe me, he cried with the same passion he did everything else, a raw, theatrical display of remorse that was impossible to doubt. He helped me up, found a bag of frozen peas for my hand, and drove me to the emergency room, telling the doctor a story about me slipping and falling against a table. And I, sitting there in a haze of pain and confusion, a part of my mind screaming that this was wrong, that this was monstrous, said nothing. I let him lie, because the only thing more terrifying than what he had done was the thought of losing the man I thought he was. I believed him. Weeks crawled by. My hand healed, encased in a plaster cast that served as a constant, ugly reminder of a truth I was trying desperately to forget. We settled into a fragile truce, a tense quiet where we never spoke of that night. He was impossibly gentle, endlessly attentive, as if trying to atone for a sin too great to name. It was during this period of brittle peace that I noticed the changes in my own body, the fatigue I couldn't shake. The faint, persistent nausea in the mornings. I bought a test from the drugstore, my hands shaking as I took it in the same bathroom where he had once drawn me a romantic bath. 2 pink lines appeared, stark and undeniable. Pregnant. My first feeling was not joy, but a cold, liquid terror. But then, a second, more dangerous emotion began to bloom in the wasteland of my fear. Hope. A baby, a family. This, I thought, would be the anchor that would steady him. This would be the reason for the violence to stop forever. A child would fix him, would fix us. It would make us whole. I chose the moment carefully, cooking his favorite meal, setting the table with our best dishes. He came home in a good mood, kissing me gently, his eyes avoiding the cast on my arm. After dinner, my heart hammering against my ribs, I took his hand. "Jacob," I began, my voice a thready whisper. "I have something to tell you. Something wonderful." He looked at me, a soft, expectant smile on his face. "I'm pregnant," I said. The smile did not fade, it froze. The warmth in his whiskey-colored eyes vanished, replaced by a flat, cold emptiness that terrified me more than his rage ever had. He slowly pulled his hand from mine. "No," he said, the word a dead weight in the air. "What do you mean, no?" I asked, a frantic laugh escaping my lips. "Yes, we're going to have a baby. No." "We're not," he said, his voice lethally calm. "You're going to get rid of it." I stared at him, the hopeful fantasy I'd constructed shattering into a million pieces. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, Jacob, I won't. This is our baby." "It's a mistake," he said, standing up. "It's a complication we don't need. You will handle it." Tears streamed down my face, tears of anger now, not fear. "I will not," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I am having this baby." That was when I saw it. The flicker in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. The stranger was coming back, but this time his rage wasn't a sudden hot explosion. It was a cold, deliberate decision. He didn't say another word. He simply walked towards me, and as I scrambled backward, my chair tipping over, I understood. The baby wasn't an anchor. It was a threat. It was a piece of me he could not control, a future he had not authored. And as his shadow fell over me, the last thing I remember thinking before the pain began was that this tiny, unborn life inside me wasn't our salvation. It was my death sentence. The world returned to me in pieces. First, the sharp geometric pattern of the Persian rug against my cheek. Then, a throbbing, tidal rhythm of pain that started in my ribs and radiated outwards, encompassing my entire body. Finally, the silence. A profound, ringing silence that was more terrifying than Jacob's rage had been. He was gone. The apartment was still and dark, save for the indifferent orange glow of a street lamp filtering through the window blinds, casting striped shadows across the room like the bars of a cage. A single primal thought cut through the fog of pain. The baby. My hand moved instinctively to my stomach, a protective, trembling gesture. It was an instinct that propelled me into motion, a desperate animal need to protect my unborn child from the monster who had just tried to destroy us both. Moving was agony. Every muscle screamed in protest. I used a dining chair to pull myself upright, my breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. The room was a mess, the overturned chair, the shattered plates from the dinner I had so hopefully prepared, a smear of blood on the pale wall where my head had hit. It was a crime scene. I was the evidence. I had to leave. The thought was absolute, the only clear thing in my mind. I couldn't call the police. My first loyalty, I realized with a sickening lurch, was still to the ghost of the man I thought Jacob was, to the fear of what my father would call a scandal. I couldn't call Sarah. I had pushed her away so completely I didn't know how to bridge the chasm I had allowed Jacob to create. There was only one place. One person, a fortress, a hero. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, gathering essentials with a fumbling, desperate haste. A small duffel bag, the cash from my wallet, my car keys. My eyes fell on a framed photo on the nightstand, taken during those first golden weeks. We were smiling, his arm wrapped tightly around me, his expression one of fierce, proud ownership. I looked at the man in the photo, this handsome, charming stranger, and felt nothing but a cold, hollow dread. I left the photo where it was. I was done with ghosts. The drive out of Chicago was a flight through a concrete labyrinth. The city lights, once so magical to me, now seemed predatory, like the glowing eyes of 1,000 watching beasts. I kept checking my rearview mirror, my heart seizing every time a pair of headlights grew too close, convinced it was him, that he was coming to drag me back. But no one followed. I was just another car in the river of red taillights flowing out of the city, a fugitive escaping a war only I knew had been waged. Once I hit the open highway, the city receding in my mirror until it was just a faint, smudgy glow against the dark horizon, a different kind of battle began. It was a battle waged in the confines of my own mind against the pain and the terror. The rhythmic thump-thump of the tires on the pavement became a hypnotic drumbeat, pulling memories from the depths. To keep the image of Jacob's face at bay, the cold fury, the empty eyes, I filled my head with my father. I drove through the long, dark hours, fueling myself with an idealized vision of Richard Sterling. I pictured him the day he taught me to ride my bike. I'd fallen and scraped my knee, and I'd run to him crying. He hadn't coddled me. He had cleaned the wound with a firm, no-nonsense touch, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Pain is temporary, Emma. Getting back on is what matters." To a child, it had sounded like the wisdom of a king. Now it was the gospel I clung to. Pain is temporary. Getting back on is what matters. I remembered being 10 and winning the school spelling bee. My father had lifted me onto his broad shoulders in front of everyone, his hands strong and sure around my ankles. "That's my girl," he had boomed, his voice full of a pride that made me feel like I could conquer the world. Smartest girl in the whole damn state. Every mile I drove, I imagined my father's arms around me, not the celebratory grip of the past, but a protective one. I pictured him calling the police, using his influence, destroying Jacob, protecting his little girl. The fantasy was so vivid, so necessary, that it felt like a premonition. He would be angry, of course, angry that I had been so foolish as to get involved with someone like Jacob. But underneath the anger, there would be love. There would be protection. He was my father. He would fix this. He had to. This mantra was a prayer whispered against the cold glass of the driver's side window, a shield against the creeping fear that I had nowhere else to go. Dawn was breaking as I took the exit for Naperville, the sky bleeding from bruised purple to a soft, hopeful gray. The change was instantaneous. The gritty, unpredictable energy of the city gave way to an ordered, manicured tranquility. Here, the lawns were impossibly green. The houses were stately and proud, set far back from the quiet, tree-lined streets. It was a world constructed to keep out ugliness and chaos. It was the world my father had built for us, and then I saw it, the house. It stood at the end of a curving street, a 2-story brick fortress of respectability. The black shutters were perfect. The landscaping was immaculate, even in the pale light of early morning. A single lamp glowed in a downstairs window, probably in the kitchen, where my mother would already be awake, starting her day with the quiet, rigid routine that governed her life. It looked safe. It looked permanent. It looked like everything my life with Jacob had not been. I pulled my car into the long, curving driveway, the crunch of the tires on the gravel, the loudest sound in the world. I killed the engine, and for a long moment I just sat there, my body a single, unified ache. I was exhausted, broken, and carrying a secret that would change everything. But I was here. I was home. I had outrun the monster. I had reached the fortress. With a shuddering breath that felt like it was being torn from my lungs, I opened the car door, walked up the familiar slate pathway, and reached for the heavy, cold brass of the front door handle. My ordeal, I believed with every fiber of my being, was finally over. The heavy door swung inward with a familiar, well-oiled sigh, opening into the cool, still air of the foyer. The house smelled exactly as I remembered, a sterile fusion of lemon polish, dried lavender from the potpourri bowl on the hall table, and the faint, underlying scent of money. For a single, deceptive heartbeat, the familiarity felt like a comforting embrace. I was home. My mother, Eleanor, appeared from the kitchen, a porcelain teacup in her hand. Her face, a carefully preserved mask of placid elegance, crumbled the moment she saw me. The teacup rattled in its saucer. Her perfectly lipsticked mouth formed a small O of horror. "Emma," she breathed, her hands flying to her cheeks. It was not the empathetic shock of a mother seeing her injured child. It was the horrified gasp of a hostess discovering a terrible stain on her pristine carpet. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted over my bruised face, the swollen line of my jaw, the way I cradled my ribs with one arm. She rushed forward, grabbing my elbow and pulling me quickly towards the kitchen, as if trying to hide me from the view of the empty hallway. "Good heavens, what has happened to you? Where have you been?" "Your father has been—" She didn't finish the sentence, instead pushing me gently into a chair at the heavy oak kitchen table. Her movements were a flurry of nervous energy, filling the kettle, opening and closing cupboards, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Did you have a car accident?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dark bruise blooming on my cheekbone. "No, Mother," I said, my voice hoarse. "It was Jacob." The name hung in the air between us. Her face paled. "Oh no," she murmured, sinking into the chair opposite me. "Oh, Emma, what have you done? A boy like that. His family is—" She trailed off again, her true fear surfacing. It wasn't for me, but for the social standing of a family she had married into, a position she guarded with anxious vigilance. She looked past me, down the long, polished hallway towards the closed door at the far end. "Your father cannot see you like this. He will be furious." As if summoned by her fear, his voice echoed down the hall, deep and authoritative. "Eleanor, who is that?" My mother flinched. She stood up, smoothing her silk blouse, her face a mask of frantic composure. "It's Emma, dear," she called back, her voice unnaturally bright. "She's just popped in for a visit." A pause. "Then, send her to my study." It wasn't a request. It was a command. My mother looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Now don't upset him," she whispered, as if the entire situation, the bruises, the terror, was a mess I had created specifically to inconvenience him. She led me to the study door and gave my arm a final, nervous squeeze before retreating, leaving me to face him alone. She hovered in the hall, a ghost in her own home, a silent, willing accomplice to whatever came next. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. My father's study was his sanctuary, the heart of his empire. The room was paneled in dark, gleaming cherry wood. Books with pristine leather spines lined the shelves, curated for appearance rather than content. Awards and plaques glinted from the walls. The air was thick with the scent of leather and his cigars. He was seated behind a vast mahogany desk, a king on his throne, the morning newspaper neatly folded beside him. He didn't rise. He simply watched me walk across the thick Persian rug, his eyes, the same color as Jacob's but colder, harder, taking in my appearance with the cool, appraising gaze of a man assessing damaged goods. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the stiff leather chair opposite the desk. I didn't. I stood before him, my hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. "Tell me what happened," he said. His tone was not that of a concerned father, but of a CEO demanding an incident report. The story tumbled out of me, a broken, whispered confession. I told him everything. The possessiveness, the first time he'd broken my hand, the pregnancy, the final brutal assault. I cried, the tears I had held back during the long drive now flowing freely, born of a desperate, foolish hope that the sight of my pain would finally break through his cold exterior. I finished, my voice choked with sobs, and stood before him, utterly exposed, awaiting his comfort, his anger, his protection. What I received was silence. A long, profound silence in which he simply stared at me, his fingers steepled under his chin. The silence stretched until it was a physical presence in the room, suffocating me. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Did anyone see him hit you?" he asked. I blinked, confused. "What?" "A witness, Emma. Was there one?" "No," I stammered. "We were at the apartment." "Have you been to a hospital?" "Is there a police report?" "No, I came straight here." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant, calculating. "And this boy's family? The Vances? They are a respectable name in the city. Will they make a scene?" The questions hit me like stones, each one harder and colder than the last. He wasn't seeing his battered, pregnant daughter. He was seeing a series of logistical problems, a potential public relations crisis. The tears stopped. A chill began to creep into my veins, a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He sighed, the weary sound of a man burdened by the incompetence of others. "You have made a foolish mistake, Emma. You got involved with a violent, unstable boy, and now there is a mess. A very public mess is the last thing this family needs." He picked up a heavy silver letter opener from his desk, turning it over and over in his hands. "You allowed this to happen? You need to be stronger. As for all this..." He gestured vaguely at my bruised face. "You're emotional. You need to put it behind you. Just move on." The words, delivered with such casual, dismissive finality, did not break me. They vaporized me. The image I had carried of my father my entire life, the hero, the protector, the strong and loving patriarch, crumbled into dust. In his place was this man, this stranger, for whom my pain was nothing more than an inconvenience. "And the baby?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. At this, he looked at me directly, his expression softening into one of feigned magnanimity. "The baby, of course, is the real problem. But it's a problem that can be managed. I will provide you with funds. You will go away for a while, somewhere quiet, until the baby is born. We will arrange for a discreet adoption, a good family. No one needs to know. It will be clean. Then, you can come back and start over. It's the most sensible solution." In that moment, Jacob's fists felt like a gentle touch compared to my father's words. Jacob had broken my body, but my father, he took a hammer to my soul. He wasn't just dismissing my pain. He was trying to erase my child, to purchase our silence, to tidy away the mess so his perfect world could remain undisturbed. I stood there in the center of that opulent, silent room, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. The fortress had not saved me. It had simply shown me the true nature of my prison. My hero had not rescued me. He had handed me my sentence. My father's plan was executed with the cold efficiency of a business merger. There was no more discussion, no room for appeal. I was a problem to be managed, a sensitive asset to be moved off the books. 2 days after my arrival, my mother drove me north, out of Illinois, and into the rolling, desolate farmland of southern Wisconsin. We barely spoke for the entire 3-hour drive. The silence in the car was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from her shame and my despair. She was not my mother on that drive. She was my father's courier, delivering a damaged parcel to a discreet location. The facility was called The Willows, a ridiculously gentle name for a place so devoid of life. It was a sprawling, former country estate, set far back from the road, hidden by a line of weeping willow trees that drooped as if in perpetual mourning. It was a place where wealth and shame intersected, a high-end holding pen for the inconvenient daughters of powerful men. There were no locks on the doors, but we were all prisoners, held captive by our families' reputations. Life at the Willows was a study in gray. The days were governed by a rigid, silent routine. Bland meals in a communal dining room where no one made eye contact. Mandatory walks in the manicured gardens where we all kept a careful distance from one another. Long, empty hours spent in our small, Spartan rooms. We were a sorority of ghosts, girls whose names and stories had been temporarily erased. We floated past each other in the hallways, our swollen bellies the only things that felt real, our eyes holding the same vacant, haunted look. I was no longer Emma Sterling. I was just a body, a vessel for a secret, waiting to be emptied so I could be returned, hollowed out, to my former life. My father sent money to the facility weekly, but he never called. I descended into a numbness so profound it was almost peaceful. The fire of my anger, the sharp edges of my grief, all of it dissolved into a thick gray fog. I would sit by the window in my room for hours, watching the willow branches sway in the wind, feeling nothing. The life growing inside me felt distant, an abstract concept rather than a part of me. It was the problem, the complication. I was simply its container. Despair became my home, a quiet, desolate country where I was the sole inhabitant. About a month into my exile, a nurse knocked on my door. "Miss Sterling," she said, her voice crisp and impersonal. "You're needed in the administration office. There are some papers for you to sign." I followed her silently down the polished hallway, assuming this was the next step in my father's neat and tidy plan, the preliminary paperwork for the adoption. My feet felt like lead. Each step was an act of surrender. The office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of old paper and disinfectant. The facility director, a severe-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, sat behind a metal desk. But she was not the one who held my attention. Standing by the window, looking out at the bleak landscape, was a man in a simple gray suit. He was thin and slightly stooped, with graying hair combed neatly over a balding patch. He turned as I entered, and I recognized him instantly. It was Arthur Finch, my father's accountant, the man who had been a quiet, almost invisible fixture in the background of my entire life, the man who tallied the numbers that built the Sterling Empire. "Arthur," I said, my voice a dead, lifeless thing. He gave me a small, sad nod. "Miss Sterling," he said. His eyes, behind thick-lensed glasses, were not cold like my father's or pitying like the nurse's. They were just observant. They saw everything. "Mr. Finch is here to finalize some of the financial arrangements for your stay and future considerations," the director said briskly, pushing a stack of papers towards me. "Sign here and here." I took the pen she offered, my hand, now free of its cast but still weak and tender, trembling slightly. I signed where she indicated, my signature, a spidery, unfamiliar scrawl. I was signing away my child. I was signing away my life. The pen felt impossibly heavy. As I pushed the papers back, the director's phone buzzed. With a sigh of annoyance, she excused herself, leaving me alone in the room with the quiet accountant. Arthur Finch stepped away from the window and approached the desk. He squared the papers I had signed into a neat pile. He did not look at me. He looked at the documents, at the numbers, at the cold, hard facts of my situation. "Your father," he began, his voice low and even, a conspiratorial murmur that wouldn't carry past the closed door, "values his assets above all else. His company, his home, his reputation. They are all entries on a ledger to him." I said nothing, just stared at the scarred knuckles of my own hand. He continued, still focused on the papers. "You must never forget that. An asset, properly managed, can grow. But an asset can also become a liability. And liabilities, Miss Sterling, liabilities have the power to erase assets entirely." He looked up then, just for a second, and his quiet, observant eyes met mine. In them, I saw no pity. I saw a flicker of something else, something I hadn't seen in months. Dissent. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of rebellion. He was my father's loyal soldier, but he was showing me a map of the king's weaknesses. He gathered his worn leather briefcase. "I believe that is all," he said, his voice returning to its normal, professional tone. As he turned to leave, a simple, black fountain pen slipped from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, clattering softly onto the desk right beside my hand. "Oh, bother," he muttered, glancing down at it distractedly. But instead of picking it up, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head and continued towards the door. "You have a good day now, Miss Sterling." And then he was gone. I was left alone in the silent, sterile office. The pen lay on the desk, a small, dark object in the oppressive grayness of the room. I stared at it for a long time. It was an accident. Of course it was an accident, but he hadn't come back for it. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out and picked it up. It felt cool and solid in my palm. I turned it over. Engraved on its side in small, neat letters was a name I didn't recognize, followed by the name of a financial advisory firm. And beneath that, an address. Not in Chicago. Not even in Illinois. It was in another state entirely. I closed my hand around the pen, its sharp edges digging into my palm. The pain was real. It was a grounding sensation in the fog of my despair. I hadn't been saved. I was still broken, still a prisoner, but the quiet accountant had not offered me sympathy. He had offered me something far more valuable. He had offered me a weapon. And as I sat there, clutching that pen in the silent heart of my exile, a single, tiny, dangerous thought, the first real thought I'd had in a month, broke through the surface of my numbness. A liability. That single, solid object in my hand changed the texture of my despair. The gray fog did not lift, but a single, hard point of focus began to form within it. The pen, the name, the address, the words of the quiet accountant. An asset can also become a liability. For the remaining months of my confinement at the Willows, these things became my secret rosary, the beads I turned over and over in the solitude of my mind. I was no longer a passive ghost. A cold reptilian purpose took root in the barren soil of my soul. I began to eat everything on my plate, no matter how bland, forcing it down with a methodical resolve. I walked the gardens every day, not with the shuffling gait of the other lost girls, but with a steady, measured pace, feeling the sun on my skin, breathing the clean country air. I was no longer simply enduring. I was preparing. I was nourishing the life inside me, not out of maternal warmth, but out of a strategist's logic. This child, this problem my father intended to erase, was my only asset, and I would protect my asset. The other girls seemed to sense the shift. They began to give me a wider berth, their downcast eyes flickering towards me with a new kind of fear, as if they could sense the cold fire I was so carefully banking. They were waiting for their erasure. I was planning a resurrection. When the labor began, it was a lonely, violent storm. The pain was a relentless tide, pulling me under, tossing me against the rocks of my own physical limits. The nurses were efficient, their voices a distant clinical murmur. There was no hand to hold, no loving words of encouragement. In the sterile white room under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, I was utterly alone, an anonymous body performing a primal, agonizing function. And then, after hours that felt like years, the storm broke. A single piercing cry cut through the haze of pain, a sound so vibrant and alive it seemed to shake the very foundations of the silent gray building. The nurse cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a simple cotton blanket. "You have a daughter," she said. Her voice softened for the first time. She placed the small, warm bundle in my arms, and the world stopped. I looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, the tuft of dark, silky hair, the impossibly small fingers curled into a fist. She was so real, so perfect. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a deep, clear blue. She was not a complication. She was not a mistake. She was a person. She was my daughter. In that instant, a wave of feeling so powerful, so fiercely protective washed through me that it scoured my soul clean of everything else. It was a love so absolute it was a form of violence in itself. It was the force that shattered the last remnants of the girl I used to be. The girl who had fallen for Jacob's charming lies. The girl who had wept in her father's study, begging for protection. The girl who had believed in heroes and happy endings. That girl, Emma Sterling, died in that stark delivery room. She died, and the love for my daughter was the force that remade me. I was no longer a victim. I was a mother. My purpose was no longer to survive. It was to ensure she thrived. And to do that, I would have to become someone else entirely. I named her Lily. It was the first decision I had made for myself in almost a year. A lily, a flower that can grow in the mud and still rise, pure and beautiful, towards the sun. A few days later, my body aching but my mind a sliver of cold, hard diamond, I put my plan into motion. I told the head nurse I felt strong enough to call my parents, to let them know the arrangements could proceed. In the privacy of the administration office, the same office where Arthur Finch had given me the pen, I did not dial my father's number. My fingers, steady now, dialed the number engraved on the side of the fountain pen. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Claremont Advisory." "Hello," I said, my voice low and even. "My name is Emma Sterling. Arthur Finch suggested I call. I need to open a new account." I could feel the operator's surprise, but I didn't give her time to question it. "It's a trust, for my daughter. The funds are being transferred from my father, Richard Sterling. But the account is to be under a new name, my new name." There was a pause. Arthur Finch's name was a key, and it turned the lock. "One moment, please," the voice said. I was transferred to a senior advisor. I explained the situation in cold, clear terms, leaving out the emotion, presenting it as a simple, if unusual, financial transaction. I was liquidating my old life and investing in a new one. The name on the new account would be Evelyn Reed, Reed for a new story to be read. Evelyn, because it felt strong, elegant, and miles away from the broken girl named Emma. My final act at the Willows was to write a letter to my parents. I filled 2 pages with the rambling, disconnected thoughts of a shattered mind. I wrote about the shadows in the corners of my room, about not being able to cope, about the need to go somewhere quiet and be alone. I left the fate of the baby ambiguous, a source of pain too great to name. It was a carefully crafted piece of fiction, designed to confirm their narrative of my tragic mental collapse. I sealed it, knowing it would be the last they ever heard from Emma Sterling. It was her suicide note. The day of my discharge arrived. A taxi, paid for with the first wire transfer from my new account, was waiting for me at the end of the long driveway. The facility staff believed I was being transferred to a private psychiatric institution in another state, an arrangement my father's office had supposedly made. They handed me a small bag containing my few possessions and the sealed letter from my parents. They did not ask to see my daughter. The baby had been a temporary condition, a problem that, as far as they were concerned, had been handled. But she hadn't been handled. She was sleeping soundly in my arms, wrapped in a warm blanket, her small weight a solid, comforting anchor. As I walked down the driveway, past the drooping willows, I did not look back. I was no longer Emma Sterling, the runaway daughter. I was Evelyn Reed, a woman walking away from a life that had been written for me, holding the hand of the only person who mattered. We were fugitives from my family's pristine world, heading towards a future they could never imagine, to fight a war they didn't even know had been declared. The road ahead was a complete unknown, a terrifying, empty map, but for the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the pen. The first few years were a lesson in the art of being invisible. I chose a small, forgettable town in Ohio, a place where no one asked questions, where a quiet woman and her baby could easily blend into the gentle, monotonous rhythm of Midwestern life. We lived in a tiny second-floor apartment that smelled of dust and old wood. I took a job at the local library, the silence and the scent of books a comforting balm. I was Mrs. Reed, the soft-spoken librarian. A widow, I let the town believe. It was a simple, sad story that satisfied their curiosity and allowed me to recede into the background. My life was bisected into 2 distinct, non-overlapping halves. By day, I was entirely Lily's. I pushed her on the swings at the park. I read her stories until my voice was hoarse. I kissed her scraped knees. I treasured the sweet, milky scent of her hair. My love for her was the only pure, uncomplicated thing in my universe. It was the sun that kept my world from freezing over. She was my reason, my purpose, my shield against the ghosts of the past. But at night, after Lily was asleep, her gentle breathing a soft rhythm in the quiet apartment, I would become someone else. I would sit at the small, wobbly kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pool of yellow light, and I would open my ledgers. The money my father had given me to disappear, the money I had entrusted to the firm on Arthur's pen, was my seed corn. Guided by my advisor, I made small, careful investments. A food processing company here, a textile manufacturer there, nurturing my small fund, making it grow. The kitchen table was my war room, the battlefield a spreadsheet of numbers and stock symbols. The first contact from Arthur came 6 months after I left the Willows. It was a postcard of the Chicago skyline, sent to the P.O. box I had established. The message was banal, something about the weather, but 3 words were faintly underlined: steel prices drop. That week, I spent hours in the library's reference section, poring over business journals. I discovered that a major steel tariff was crippling smaller suppliers, including one that was a key contractor for Sterling Industries. The knowledge was a small, sharp tool. I didn't act on it, not yet. It was too soon, but I understood the game. Arthur would not give me instructions. He would give me information. He would show me the loose threads. It was up to me to do the weaving. And so, the loom was built, thread by invisible thread, over the slow, patient turning of the years. My father told me to move on. So I did. I moved on to a new name, a new city, and a new purpose. They thought I was a ghost. But a ghost can see everything. And through Arthur, my ghost had hands. When Lily started kindergarten, her small hand clutching mine as we stood at the school gate, I was just another proud, misty-eyed mother. That night, after she was asleep, I made a call to my advisor and established the first shell corporation, a bland, anonymous entity registered in Delaware, Prairie Investments. The years spooled out. We moved twice, first to Pennsylvania, then finally settling in a small, lovely house in Savannah, Georgia, when Lily was in middle school. I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small shipping company, a position that gave me a deeper understanding of logistics and corporate finance. Lily blossomed into a bright, kind, fiercely intelligent girl. She had my eyes, but none of my shadows. On the night of her high school graduation, I sat in the audience, my heart swelling with a pure, uncomplicated pride as she, the class valedictorian, delivered her speech about building a future of compassion and integrity. She was everything good in the world. Later that week, a postcard arrived from Arthur. The message was about his supposed niece's art show, but the underlined words were executive health concerns. My research revealed that the vice president of Sterling Industries, a man who had been my father's right hand for 30 years, was battling a serious illness. The news had not been made public, but the internal uncertainty had caused the company's non-voting stock to dip to a 5-year low. Prairie Investments, its coffers now considerably fuller from 2 decades of my patient investing, made its first significant purchase of Sterling stock. It was a silent, invisible transaction, a ghost buying a piece of its own haunted house. My nightly ritual became more intense. After helping Lily with her MCAT prep, after talking with her about her dreams of becoming a pediatrician, I would retreat to my study. The walls were covered not in family photos, but in stock charts and timelines. I knew the rhythms of my father's company better than he did. I knew its seasonal vulnerabilities, its political dependencies, its pension liabilities. Arthur's discreet tips pointed me to the cracks, and I learned how to insert a financial lever into each one. I created 2 more shell corporations, Midwest Holdings and Tidewater Group, each one a separate, anonymous entity, each one slowly, patiently acquiring shares. When Lily was accepted into Johns Hopkins for medical school, I wept with joy. We celebrated with a special dinner at her favorite restaurant. She spoke excitedly about her future, and I saw in her the woman she was becoming, strong, brilliant, and full of grace. She was my greatest achievement, the one true asset in my life. That same month, I consolidated my holdings. My personal wealth was now substantial. I formed a final, master entity, a holding company that would absorb the others. It needed a name that held a secret meaning, a name that was a quiet declaration of my purpose. I named it AR Holdings. The world would assume it stood for Arthur, but I knew the truth. It stood for Emma and Reed, for the girl who had been erased, and for the daughter who was her legacy. Decades passed. Lily became Dr. Reed, a successful pediatrician in Atlanta. I was Evelyn Reed, a seemingly ordinary retiree in Savannah, known for my beautiful rose garden and my quiet, solitary life. No one would ever have connected the gentle, gray-haired woman who volunteered at the local hospital with the silent, formidable force behind AR Holdings. My stake in Sterling Industries had grown from a handful of shares to a torrent. Using obscure legal loopholes that Arthur's letters had pointed me towards, I had converted massive blocks of non-voting stock into shares that held power. I was no longer just an investor. I was a presence, a silent majority owner in waiting. The long, patient years of accumulation were over. The threads were all in place, pulled taut on the loom. The pattern was a map of my father's empire, and at its center was a knot of my own making, ready to be pulled. The time for simply watching from the shadows was ending. It was nearly time to begin to unravel it all. The beginning of the end started not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet, unnerving tremor in the foundations of my father's world. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, a couple of years before the funeral. In the main boardroom on the top floor of the Sterling Industries Tower in Chicago, a room I knew only from photographs and annual reports, my father was presiding over a quarterly meeting. From what Arthur later described in a letter, Richard Sterling, then in his late 80s, was a diminished king. The iron certainty had been replaced by a brittle, almost transparent frailty. His voice, once a commanding baritone, had become thin and reedy. He leaned heavily on the man seated at his right hand, a man in his late 40s, his suit impeccably tailored, his face radiating the handsome, predatory confidence of a wolf who knows he is the strongest in the pack. It was Jacob Vance. Years earlier, my father, in a move of spectacular and bitter irony, had hired Jacob, seeing in him a reflection of his own youthful ruthlessness. He'd praised him as a strong, decisive man, the kind of man needed to secure the Sterling legacy. Jacob had risen quickly, becoming the company's chief operating officer, my father's trusted heir apparent. He was the son my father never had, the guardian of the empire. He had no idea the woman whose life he had shattered was about to take a sledgehammer to its gates. The meeting was interrupted when a lawyer entered, his face pale. He delivered the news in a hushed, urgent tone. A mysterious entity, a holding company no one had ever heard of called AR Holdings, had, in a series of silent, breathtakingly swift market moves, acquired a 15% stake in Sterling Industries. They were now the largest single shareholder outside of the Sterling Family Trust, and they were demanding a seat on the board. A stunned silence fell over the room. My father's hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. Jacob, however, was the picture of arrogant composure. He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "Some vulture fund from New York trying to shake us down," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let them try. We'll bleed them dry and leave their carcass on the side of the road. Don't worry, Richard. I'll handle it." And so, Jacob took charge, fighting a war against a shadow, completely unaware that the ghost general commanding the other side knew his every weakness, his every vanity. He launched an aggressive, expensive defense playing right into my hands. From my quiet study in Savannah, I directed the battle. AR Holdings was my vanguard, the public face of the assault. We initiated a messy public proxy battle, creating chaos and uncertainty among the other shareholders. Acting on Arthur's carefully worded information about aging infrastructure in our manufacturing plants, I had an intermediary anonymously leak a damning report to a prominent business journalist. The resulting article was a disaster for the company's image. The stock price, already shaken, began a steady, sickening slide. The panic in the Sterling boardroom became palpable. In another meeting, a few months later, Jacob, desperate to show strength, proposed a radical move. To finance their war against AR Holdings, he argued they should sell off the company's freight and logistics division. It was one of the oldest parts of the company, a stable but unglamorous workhorse. "It's dead weight," Jacob argued, his voice full of slick conviction. "We sell it, we build a war chest, and we crush these bastards." My father, his judgment clouded by fear and his misplaced faith in Jacob's aggression, agreed. The division was put up for sale in a fire sale, priced well below its true value to ensure a quick transaction. That afternoon, sitting in my sunlit garden, a cup of tea on the table beside me, I made a phone call. My voice was calm and steady. I authorized my other silent shell company, the Tidewater Group, to submit a bid for the Sterling Freight Division. We acquired it for a fraction of its worth. Jacob and my father thought they had amputated a limb to save the body. They had no idea they had sold their spine to their own executioner. The pressure mounted relentlessly. AR Holdings made another move, then another, each one perfectly timed to exploit a new weakness. We were a phantom, an enemy they couldn't understand. We didn't operate by the usual corporate raider playbook. Our moves seemed erratic, designed not just to gain control, but to sow chaos, to devalue the very prize we were supposedly fighting for. The strain was too much for my father. His health, already fragile, began to collapse. Arthur wrote that he'd taken to wandering the executive floor at night, a stooped, haunted figure staring at the falling stock prices on the monitors. He was a man watching his life's work, his monument to himself, being dismantled brick by an enemy he couldn't see. The final blow came on a Thursday. AR Holdings, using its significant leverage, had forced an independent audit of the company's pension fund, a fund which Arthur's letters had hinted had been poorly managed for years. The news sent the stock into a free fall. That evening, I received a call. It was not from Arthur, but from the lawyer who managed the trust I had established for Lily decades before. His voice was grim. "Evelyn," he said, I just heard from my contacts in Chicago. Richard Sterling had a massive stroke this afternoon in his office. He's at Northwestern Memorial. The prognosis is not good. They don't expect him to survive the week. I thanked him for the information and hung up the phone. I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of vengeance. I simply felt the quiet, cold finality of a long and complex equation finally being solved. I walked over to my window and looked out at my roses, their petals glowing in the fading light. The house of cards, so meticulously constructed over a lifetime of pride and cruelty, built on a foundation of my own silence, was falling at last. It was time to go home and watch. The drive from the funeral home to the lawyer's office was a silent, tense affair. The family limousine, smelling of leather and refrigerated air, was a bubble of unspoken greed and resentment. My relatives, having performed their public duty of sorrow, were now focused on the final act, the division of the spoils. I sat in the corner, a quiet island in their sea of avarice, my composure a silent rebuke to their barely concealed anticipation. Jacob Vance was in the car as well, not as family, but as a key executive, his presence a testament to how deeply he had embedded himself in my father's world. He avoided my gaze, his expression a mask of professional solemnity, but I could see the tension in his jaw. The battle with AR Holdings had taken its toll, but he still believed he was on the winning side. The law firm of Albright Sterling occupied the top 2 floors of a skyscraper that pierced the Chicago sky. The name itself was a monument to my father's ego, having added his own name to the partnership decades ago. We were ushered into a conference room with a glass wall that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the city below. It was a room designed to intimidate, to remind you of the power wielded within its walls. We took our seats around a vast, polished mahogany table that felt as large and cold as a tombstone. My mother, Eleanor, looking small and lost, sat beside me, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. Mr. Albright, the firm's senior partner, entered the room. He was a tall, silver-haired man in a suit that cost more than my first car. He was the high priest of my father's religion of wealth and power, and he presided over this final ceremony with an air of grave importance. He nodded curtly to the family members, his eyes resting on me for a moment, with a look of polite, dismissive pity. The poor, troubled daughter, here to witness a legacy she had no part in. "We are gathered today," he began, his voice a dry, practiced monotone, "to execute the last will and testament of Richard Sterling." He opened the heavy document before him and began to read. The preliminary bequests were predictable and meaningless, a collection of antique maps to a cousin who had never traveled, my father's vintage car collection to an uncle who lived in a condominium. To my mother, he left her jewelry, a lifetime supply of the pretty, sparkling things he had used to distract her, and the right to live in the Naperville house for the remainder of her life, after which it would be turned over to the estate. She received the news with a faint, bewildered nod, as if hearing the terms of a contract she had never been allowed to negotiate. Finally, Albright arrived at the heart of the will. "As to the remainder of my estate," he read, his voice taking on a more resonant, theatrical tone, "including all personal assets and my controlling interest in Sterling Industries. It is my will and decree that these assets shall be used to form a charitable foundation." He paused for effect. "The Richard Sterling Foundation for Civic Progress, an institution dedicated to the betterment of this great city and the preservation of the values of hard work and integrity that have guided my life." A wave of surprised murmurs rippled through the room. It was a brilliant final move, a way for my father to cheat his grasping relatives out of their inheritance while simultaneously cementing his name in stone for eternity. Jacob Vance, who had been sitting rigid in his chair, visibly relaxed. If the company was held by a foundation, his executive position was secure. The family might be angry, but the empire itself was safe, preserved as a permanent monument to its founder. It was my father's final, perfect act of control from beyond the grave. Or so he had thought. Mr. Albright finished the passage and neatly stacked the pages. He looked up at the assembled family, a faint, satisfied smile on his lips, but then his eyes scanned the next page and the smile vanished. He cleared his throat. A flicker of discomfort, of uncertainty, crossed his face. However, he said, and that single word sliced through the atmosphere of finality. Every eye in the room snapped to him. There is a codicil, executed last month. He picked up a separate single sheet of paper, his reluctance obvious. This codicil pertains to the matter of the company shares bequeathed to the foundation. He took a deep breath. It acknowledges that due to recent and significant market activity, the shares held by the Sterling Family Trust no longer constitute a controlling interest in the company. The room erupted. My Uncle Robert was on his feet. What? That's impossible. We always held 53%. Jacob's face was ashen. AR Holdings, he whispered, the name of his phantom enemy, a curse on his lips. Albright held up a hand, his professional calm strained to the breaking point. According to official filings confirmed this morning, he continued, his voice tight, AR Holdings has, as of the close of market yesterday, secured 51% of the voting shares of Sterling Industries. They are, effective immediately, the new majority owner. It was a nuclear bomb detonating in the silent, opulent room. Chaos reigned. My relatives were shouting at Albright, at each other. The foundation, the legacy, the entire carefully constructed narrative of Richard Sterling's eternal triumph. All of it had just been rendered meaningless. Their inheritance wasn't a controlling stake in an empire. It was now just a minority share in a company owned by a hostile, unknown entity. In the midst of the pandemonium, I sat perfectly still, a silent observer at the heart of the storm I had created. Albright, his face grim, rapped his knuckles on the table for order. There is more, he announced into the maelstrom. The shouting subsided, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. The representative from AR Holdings, he said, reading directly from the page, has invoked their legal right, as majority shareholder, to be present for the remainder of these proceedings. Every head turned towards the heavy oak door of the conference room. Jacob stared at it, his face a mask of disbelief and a dawning, sickening dread. Who were they? Who was this enemy that had outmaneuvered them at every turn, that had humbled the great Richard Sterling, that had stolen their company from under their very noses? As if on cue, a soft, polite knock sounded from the other side of the door. The sound was as loud and final as a gavel strike. The moment had arrived. "Come in," Mr. Albright called out, his voice tight with irritation at this unwelcome intrusion. The heavy oak door swung open. The junior lawyer who had escorted us in held it open, his face a mask of nervous confusion. The figure who stepped inside was not the corporate titan everyone expected. It was a man who seemed to have been fashioned from dust and shadows. He was old, frail, his shoulders stooped inside a neat but unremarkable suit. He walked with a slow, careful shuffle, leaning slightly on a simple wooden cane. "Arthur?" my Uncle Robert sputtered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "What in God's name are you doing here?" It was Arthur Finch, my father's quiet, unassuming accountant, the man they had all seen for 50 years but never truly noticed. He ignored the outburst, his journey across the room a slow, deliberate pilgrimage. His eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, found mine. For a fraction of a second, a small, knowing smile touched his lips. It was a shared secret, a 45-year-old promise finally brought into the light. He gave me a nod so subtle it was almost invisible, a final, silent transfer of power. He stopped before the head of the table. "Oh." "Mr. Albright," he said, his voice surprisingly firm and clear. "I am here on behalf of the principal owner of AR Holdings." The room buzzed with confusion. Jacob stared at the old man, a sneer forming on his lips. "You?" he scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur." "You're the bookkeeper." Before Arthur could reply, I rose from my chair. The soft rustle of my dress was the only sound, and it drew every eye in the room. I stood in my simple, dark wool dress, a ghost at their feast of grief and greed. "He is not the owner," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "He is my representative." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before I delivered the first blow. "AR Holdings," I explained, my gaze sweeping the room before landing on Jacob, "doesn't stand for Arthur Reed. It stands for Emma and Reed, my name, and my daughters." A cousin frowned. "Emma? Who is Emma?" But Jacob didn't need to ask. He was staring at me, his face pale, his arrogant smirk frozen and beginning to crumble. For the first time, he was truly looking at me, past the gray hair and the quiet composure, and seeing the ghost he'd tried to bury nearly half a century ago. The recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a wave of pure, abject terror. "You," he whispered, the sound barely audible. "Yes," I said, my voice dropping, becoming more personal, a stiletto of ice aimed directly at his heart. "You remember Emma, don't you, Jacob?" I turned my attention back to the room at large, my voice regaining its steady, measured cadence. I was no longer speaking to them as a relative. I was addressing them as a historian correcting a false record. "You told me to get rid of her," I said, my eyes locking with Jacob's once more. "My father told me to move on." My gaze shifted to the head of the table, to the empty chair where my father's ghost still presided. So I did. I moved on to a new name and a new life, and for 45 years, every dollar my father sent to make me disappear, every check written to ensure my silence and erase my child, I used to buy a piece of him. Every time this company's stock dipped because of your arrogance, my eyes returned to Jacob and his pride. I looked around at my stunned relatives. I was there to catch it. I used the money from my exile to finance my return. The story unfolded in the horrified silence of the room. I explained it all, the shell corporations, the quiet acquisitions, the patient, decades-long siege. This company, I concluded, my voice resonating with the weight of my lifelong secret, was not built on my father's genius alone. It was built on my mother's silence. I glanced at Eleanor, who had shrunk into her chair, her face a blank canvas of incomprehension. It was built on Arthur's integrity, and it was paid for in full by my pain. Today, the silence ends. I let that sink in, watching the web of their world tear apart. Then, I delivered the final, killing thrust. I looked directly at Jacob Vance, who seemed to have aged 20 years in as many seconds. "The company is mine now," I said with cold, quiet finality, "and my first act as majority shareholder is to clean house." You can't," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I can," I said. "Jacob Vance, you are fired. Your security credentials have been revoked. A guard is waiting outside this room to escort you from the building. Do not return to your office. Your personal effects will be mailed to you." The room imploded. My uncle lunged to his feet, shouting obscenities. A cousin began to weep hysterically. Mr. Albright stared, his mouth agape, the legal documents forgotten in his hands. And my mother, my poor, fragile mother, made a small wounded sound and slid gracefully from her chair onto the floor in a dead faint. But my eyes remained on Jacob. The wolf was gone. In his place was a terrified, broken man, staring at the ghost who had not only returned from the grave, but had become the master of his universe. He stumbled backward, away from the table, away from me, his face a mask of utter ruin. The war was over. I had won. The chaos that erupted in the conference room was merely the first tremor of the earthquake that would shake the House of Sterling to its foundations, while paramedics attended to my mother and a stunned security guard escorted a hollow-eyed Jacob Vance from the building. I, with Arthur quietly by my side, began the systematic process of taking control. The dazed and furious members of my family were politely but firmly informed by my new legal team that their presence was no longer required. They were relics of a deposed regime. The story, of course, did not stay within the glass walls of that room. Photos of him, his face gaunt and unshaven, being hounded by reporters outside his palatial Chicago home, were everywhere. The man who had moved through the world with such arrogant assurance was now a pariah, a public symbol of brutal hypocrisy. His career was over. His social circle evaporated. He was left with nothing but his wealth, which could not buy back his name, and the ghost of the woman who had so completely and patiently ruined him. The Sterling name itself, once a byword for civic leadership and industrial might, was now inextricably linked to a scandal far more potent than the one my father had feared. His carefully constructed legacy of pride was shattered, replaced by a sordid tale of cruelty and betrayal. My remaining family retreated into their suburban fortresses, closing the drapes against a world that now saw them not as pillars of the community, but as characters in a Gothic tragedy. My mother was moved to a quiet, private care facility, her mind having retreated from a reality too harsh for her fragile sensibilities to bear. I did not revel in the destruction. My work was not about vengeance, it was about correction. I flew back to Chicago and walked into the CEO's office on the top floor of the Sterling Tower. The opulent, masculine decor that had been my father's signature was the first thing to go. I had it all removed, replaced with clean lines, modern art, and light. It was no longer a king's throne room, it was a place of business. I did not liquidate the company. A wrecking ball is a clumsy tool. I preferred a scalpel. With Arthur as my silent, constant advisor, I began to restructure. I spent weeks meeting with department heads, listening and observing. I promoted a brilliant, capable woman named Maria Flores to be the new chief operating officer, a woman who had been repeatedly passed over for promotion by my father and Jacob. I invested in the infrastructure that had been neglected. I restored the pension fund. I brought integrity and stability back to the company my pain had purchased. The employees, who had been bracing for a hostile takeover and mass layoffs, responded with a fierce, revitalized loyalty. My first official act as the sole owner of the Sterling estate was a quiet one, performed in a lawyer's office with none of the drama of the will reading. I signed a single document that legally dissolved the Richard Sterling Foundation for Civic Progress. With a simple stroke of a pen, my father's final, egotistical monument to himself was turned to dust. In its place, a new entity was born. I poured my energy, my intellect, and a significant portion of the company's profits into its creation. It was the entire point of the last 45 years. We called it the Lilly Foundation. Its mission was clear, and its resources were vast. It was to be a national organization dedicated to empowering the victims of domestic abuse. It wouldn't just provide temporary shelter, it would provide the tools for a new life. It would fund legal aid to help women untangle themselves from their abusers. It would offer grants for education and job training. It would provide relocation funds and childcare assistance. It would give them everything I never had, a network of support, a belief in their future, and the financial independence to build it. It was not charity. It was an arsenal. When the foundation was ready, we announced it to the world. I did not attend the press conference. My face, my story, had already served its purpose. I remained in Savannah, a private citizen. The announcement was made by Maria Flores, the new CEO of Sterling Industries, and the esteemed former judge I had appointed to run the foundation. They stood before a wall of cameras and reporters and spoke of a new chapter, of a company dedicated to turning a painful past into a powerful force for positive change. I watched it all on a television in my quiet living room, my daughter's namesake appearing on the screen, the Lilly Foundation. My revenge wasn't about destroying what they had built. It was about taking the foundation of my pain and building something that could shelter others. My father's legacy, built on power and pride, was gone. In its place, my daughter's legacy, a legacy of hope, of strength, of survival, was just beginning. The reckoning was complete. The accounts were finally settled. The Georgia sun was warm on my back, a gentle, benevolent heat that felt like a blessing. My garden in Savannah was my sanctuary, a world of my own making. Decades of patient work had transformed a patch of tired earth into a riot of color and fragrance. The air was heavy with the sweet perfume of jasmine climbing the old brick walls and the complex, spicy scent of the deep red roses I was carefully tending. This was my peace, earned and cultivated over a lifetime. A shadow fell over the flower bed, and I looked up. My daughter, Lily, stood there, a soft smile on her face. She was in her 40s now, a successful pediatrician, a wife, a mother, her eyes clear and kind, untouched by the shadows that had shaped my own life. She sat down on the small stone bench beside the roses, and I sat next to her, pulling off my gardening gloves. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, a silence born of a new and total understanding. After the events in Chicago, after the dust had settled, I had finally told her everything. The whole story, from the boy on Chestnut Street, to the pen in the gray office, to the long secret war waged from a kitchen table at night. I had owed her the truth, and she had received it not with shock or anger, but with a quiet, profound empathy that was the greatest gift she could have ever given me. Her children, my grandchildren, 8-year-old Sam and 6-year-old Clara, were chasing each other on the far side of the lawn, their joyous shrieks a happy counterpoint to the garden's tranquility. They were the future, vibrant and free, a legacy written in laughter. "They're beautiful," I said softly, watching them. "They are," Lily agreed. She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot, Mom, about everything, about Grandpa Richard and Jacob." She said the names without flinching, a doctor diagnosing a disease that had long since been excised. She looked around at the peaceful garden, at the beautiful house, at her children playing freely under the sun. "After all that," she asked, her voice gentle but direct, her eyes searching mine. "After 45 years of secrets and planning and fighting, all the pain it cost you, was it worth it?" It was the final question, the one that lay at the heart of it all. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my own hands, the skin thin and spotted with age, the knuckles swollen slightly with arthritis. I saw the faint, silvery scar on my left hand, the ghost of a bone broken long ago. These hands had changed diapers, held fevers at bay, and signed documents that brought an empire to its knees. They were the hands of a survivor. "They took a girl named Emma, and they tried to bury her," I said finally, my voice a quiet murmur. "Your grandfather, Jacob. They thought that by hiding her shame, by silencing her, she would just disappear. Turn to dust." I paused, meeting my daughter's gaze. But they didn't realize they had planted a seed. A warm breeze rustled the leaves of the magnolia tree above us. "Every day of your life, Lily," I continued. "Every scraped knee I bandaged, every report card I hung on the refrigerator, every time I saw you laugh without a shadow of fear in your eyes, that was my answer. My goal was never just to punish them. My goal was to protect you, to give you a life utterly different from the one they had planned for you and me. Every day I watched you grow, happy and safe and strong, was worth it, 1,000 times over." I gestured with my hand, a sweep that took in the roses, the laughing children, the warm sunlight filtering through the trees. "This," I said, a feeling of pure, unadulterated peace settling over me. "This is what it was all for. Not the boardroom, not the headlines, not the look on Jacob's face. This..." A quiet afternoon in a garden, a family, freedom. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and loving. I looked at her, my brilliant, compassionate daughter, and then at the grandchildren who were her gift to the world, and I felt the last tight knot of tension in my soul finally, completely, dissolve. My face, I knew, was a map of a long and difficult journey. The lines around my eyes were etched by years of worry and sleepless nights. The set of my mouth was a testament to decades of secrets held and disciplines maintained. But as I smiled at my daughter, a genuine, unburdened smile, I knew that the journey had led me here, to this place of grace. It was not the face of a victim. It was the face of a survivor, an architect, a mother. It was the face of Evelyn Reed. And it was, at long last, at peace.